Chandra, and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, based here in New Zealand. My name's Ian Kaplan, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to episode one in a monthly series of conversations. And this month is a conversation about regulatory language. I suspect really more navigating regulatory language. Before we go any further than that, I'm going to open today with a karakia. It's the karakia, the opening karakia of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, where the GREG Secretariat is based. I do so now. Tawhia tō mana kia mau, kia maia, tahuri takuaru ki te pai kahurangi. Kei rera te oranga moku. Ma mahi tahi ka ora ka puawai, a mātou mahi katoa ka pono ka tika, tihei mauri ora. Now we're together, you're very welcome here, wherever and indeed whenever you are. I say whenever you are because many of you will be watching this webinar live, but as you know, when you sign the invitation, it's recorded as well. It's in the public domain, both live and recorded, because we want loads of people to see it. And I say wherever you are because while the audience is probably primarily domestic, based here in New Zealand, we have an international reach through our sister networks and communities of practice for national regulators, community of practice in Australia through ANSOC and the Institute of Regulation in the United Kingdom. Wherever and whenever you are. It's always the case, I say, with these gigs, members of the audience. We're very welcome here. And what are we talking about today? We're talking about regulatory language. And we have a glossary of guests to help us deal with that. All trades are riddled with terms of art. Whatever we do for a living, phrases, context, it's absolutely no different for the regulatory profession, regulatory professionals, and those connected with them, and the business of government. But are we speaking the same language? And how much of a conversation stopper is it if we're not? As I say, we've got a glossary of guests, and today's guests have one very profound thing in common. They believe that it's absolutely critical to get regulatory language right for a number of reasons. Because our first guest, very much a friend of GREG, you may have seen him last year, is Professor Grant Pink from the University of Tasmania. He waves at us now. He's a pracademic. He'll probably tell you a bit about what that means more. And he's also written a book. He's just released it called Navigating Regulatory Practice, an A to Z Guide. We're also joined by Pelin Fantham, who's the General Manager of Operations at WorkSafe and has really super acumen in terms of looking at what regulatory language means in practice and why it's important. We also have one of the most senior lawyers in the New Zealand government, Dr. Katie Elkin, who's the Deputy Solicitor General, System Leadership at the Crown Law Office, and will come with very much the twin barrels of looking at the regulatory craft in its own strict sense, but also naturally through the legal lens and the rule of law under which it operates. And Katie and I worked together on The Judge Over Your Shoulder, the film jointly produced by the Crown Law Office, GREG and the Government Legal Network, on why it's really important to get regulatory language right. Otherwise, you may just bump into a judge over your shoulder. So I'm welcoming all of our colleagues as guests, and members of the audience, I'm welcoming you too, because this isn't just a conversation between the four of us, it's a conversation with you. Now, you'll see at the bottom of your screen that you've got the Q&A function. Absolutely open fire at any time in terms of using that channel to ask us questions. I'll catch them, we'll filter them, and we'll get the conversation going round. In parallel to that, and please don't feel it's rude to do so, there's a chat function where you can talk to each other, because as much as anything else, this is a networking, multilateral conversation. And it's great to see when the chat lines are buzzing everywhere. And I can see some hellos coming through. That's exactly how it should be, members of the audience. So without further ado, let's get to business. Now, Grant, to you first, if I may. Your book answers 6 questions. I think I count them on fingers. Who's it for? What does regulatory language cover? Where, when, and how is it used? And why do we need it? And we could be asking exactly the same question about the need for a cohesive and coherent regulatory language. So I guess, why do we need a common regulatory language?
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you very much, GREG, for having me on this panel. And I wish I had looked at the bios a bit deeper about Pelin and Katie, because now I wish I had boned up on the book a little bit more. It's no pressure at all here. I think to start with the 6, the who, when, what, why, where, and how. So the investigator regulatory types will understand that to be the 5 W and H, or sometimes the 6 loyal servants. that's the way we tend to think in regulation, compliance, and enforcement. So I think approaching the book with those 6 steps, who's it for? Primarily for those who are engaged in core operational work in government. That's the tier 1. Then the tier 2 are those that aren't involved in core operational regulatory work, but intersect and support the former. And the third one, it opens right up to stakeholders, regulated entities, academics, researchers, really anyone and everyone who is either impacted by or interested in regulation. To your last point, Ian, it's important because it's important. And I know that's a bit naff at this stage, but I'll probably come back to that right at the end and say, have we convinced you as a panel that it is indeed important? Thank you.
Well, I think one of the things that we mentioned is actually this series of conversations is very much brought to you, if I may say so, members of the audience, by you, because we polled quite a number of you last year in relation to the GREG 2021 webinars, which were conversations as the sub-theme. And broadly speaking, I think I can say that the feedback was, we liked it, but we'd like you to double the length. So we're giving you an hour today, and that seems to be the plan going forward. I do say, if there are any conversations that you'd like to see had with you, in front of you in other episodes, get in touch with us on the GREG website, greg.govt.nz. You can also see the catalogue of our other films and webinars and the YouTube channel. Grant, staying with you for a moment, because I just want to focus on the audience and on the book. And members of the audience, you're not shy. I know I've seen the guest list, so open fire with any questions as this moves along. Who would you say the book is for in the sense of the group of people, and why?
Well, there's probably a couple of concepts which would help me answer that. So there's in the book, there's a spectrum called the extended regulatory spectrum. So it's 6 component parts. The first one is regulatory regime design. And the last one, the 6th one, is regulator performance and evaluation. That work is usually done by the policy people. We establish the regulatory framework or system, and then 3, 5, 10 years later, we assess it and we evaluate how we've gone. The 4 central columns or aspects are advice and guidance, licensing and approvals, monitoring compliance, and enforcement. So really, when I first started writing the book, I was thinking about the operational doers who give advice and guidance on a scheme, assess and issue the licenses or approvals, monitor compliance and do enforcement, that operational bell curve. But we can't do it on our own. We've got lots of history and reports written about the disconnect between the policy expectations and the performance at the end. So it's anyone who works across that spectrum, either holistically, taking the New Zealand regulatory stewardship ecosystem approach, or in a component part as a specialist investigator, as a specialist auditor, as a specialist scientific assessor. So that's probably where I'd give the opening comments in.
Thank you for that, Grant. And I think it's a very, very broad church. Katie, I just wonder if I could bring you in here, because I could see you nodding. And that's always a trap when it comes to inviting questions. But I mean, the Judge Over Your Shoulder was a classic piece of work in the sense of inviting the need for cohesive regulatory language and getting the language right, wasn't it? That idea of quality decision making and getting language correct.
Yeah, I think language is often about process. It often describes the process, it describes the steps we go through. And when we're thinking about regulatory decision-making, or indeed any administrative decision-making, it's important that we do put in place those bits that need to be in there in terms of a robust process. And Judge Over Your Shoulder is really saying, you know, if I end up with a judge actually looking at this, and where am I going to end up? So, you know, the courts might become involved in this regulatory work through somebody judicially reviewing an outcome, and that's about process or an appeal of a process. And so the courts have their language, lawyers have their language, and we've got this regulatory language, and those things must be understood in a cohesive way in order to get from the coalface regulatory work through to potential challenge in the court and still all be on the same page and understanding each other there. So yeah, Judge Over Your Shoulder, I'll put in my quick plug for that as well. You've put in a plug for the movie version, Ian, and thank you for bringing that together. There's actually a much bigger document available on the New Zealand Crown Law website, which takes you right through all the steps you need to go through in terms of making robust decisions, including regulatory decisions. So go and have a look at that if you're interested.
Thank you very much. A commercial plug for both. Pelin, I'll bring you in if I may at this point, because I think a lot of this goes to the currency of regulation and if you like, what's been described as a regulatory craft. It's not just regulators talking amongst themselves the importance of language, is it? I mean, we bother about this because there's a wider frame.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I mean, it's important that all people that might be involved with regulators have a little bit of an understanding of the language being used, because obviously they, if you're thinking about a regulated party, will be on the end of those actions. But if you're working with other regulators, it's really important to understand exactly what it is that you're talking about. And we talked a bit about efficiency, or the book talks about being efficient and that type of thing. So if you think about two different regulatory agencies talking about something in quite a different manner, then obviously that isn't particularly efficient. If you take the word or the phrase surveillance, for example, if one agency might look at their monitoring regime as being a form of surveillance. But if you were to talk to somebody from a traditional kind of law enforcement policing background, surveillance is a very, very different thing. So, if you're not on the same page with actually what it is that you're trying to do, if you're working together, then that can be quite problematic and waste quite a bit of time and energy actually preparing for something that's quite different.
And it's going really to regulatory stewardship, efficiency, and all of these arguments wherever you are in the kind of the structural chain, and indeed those connected outside it. And we're going to play a little game, members of the audience, at this point. This is where you get involved. And it's who do you think you are? And it's not some sort of BBC show about family trees where you discover that your ancestor was a Victorian dodgy person who probably engaged a lot of regulators working across government in the 19th century to deal with you, and then you spontaneously break down. He says cynically, it's actually, who do you identify with archetypally and professionally? We're in a second, I think, going to have a slide of the 4 characters that appear in the frame of Grant's book. They're archetypes. They're people who Grant has created based on experiences that he's had, obviously, professionally. I don't know where he's met these people. He may tell you that. But we have Alicia, Brian, Chandra, and Dwayne. And we're going to introduce them to you in a moment, because we're then going to say, do you think you're, broadly speaking, like any of these people in terms of fitting their background, or are you going to be an option 5, none of the above? We'll just go through a sort of pen portrait of them. And Katie, I wonder if first of all you could please go through Alicia and tell us about her.
Yes, indeed. So Alicia is actually an experienced comms professional. So she's used to writing in plain language, to explaining things in response to media requests and putting out media alerts. And she's come into this regulatory agency, first time she's ever been in a regulatory agency, and she knows her craft well. And she arrives and is slightly confused about the language that everybody is using. It's not a language she's familiar with. There are a lot of buzzwords that she doesn't quite understand. And it's really important for her, as the voice of that regulatory organisation, to understand what those words mean and to be able to marry them up to the concepts and ideas that she, may already know about, but does not have that language for. She needs to be able to quickly get up to speed with that language and the way her agency is using the language, so that she can almost, translate that into the comms appropriate language to do her job. So this book would be incredibly useful for her. I think while we've chosen that she's a, experienced comms professional, there are other professional backgrounds, people that come into regulatory agencies who would face similar challenges.
It's an interesting one, isn't it, Katie? Because it's quite a biggie. You've got those regulatory agencies that are fronting the media, that are often on the wrong side of the media, or have to answer awkward questions. And those who are effectively mouthpiecing it and communicating it and conveying it, if they're not on message with the basic kind of terms and conditions of the arts of it, there's an immediate disconnect. So I don't know how many Alyssa's we have in the audience, but hold that thought there because it may be you. Pelin, could you please introduce us to Brian?
Certainly. So Brian is new to a regulatory agency in a enforcement type role, but has been a police officer for many years. So from a traditional kind of law enforcement background. And where the book would be useful for Brian is to understand all of the other regulatory levers that might be available to him during the course of his work outside of the traditional prosecution type levers. So from the background that he's from, he's looking at crimes, and they generally will be leading to a prosecution. But in the regulatory context, there are many other levers that can be used as well. So understanding what they are, and understanding what they are when people are talking about them. So if you're in meetings and discussing all of the different options that you have available to you, knowing actually what that means.
Thank you, Pelin. And I think what we've got there is perhaps someone who's transferred over from, say, a policing background or a more mainstream traditional coercive enforcement background, but across different agencies, we'll call them different things. I'll say the C word, customer, or whatever it is. That sort of educational compliance leverage, which isn't just for traditional more coercive or automatically coercive arm. And so those bits of language that apply there, Brian is very much, I think, a candidate for that. Grant, would you like to tell us about Chandra, please?
Look, I will, Ian, thank you. And but before I do, you've used the customer word. So I know Keith Manch would be watching this and he would be jumping through the screen, about to chat something there. So let's park customer, but please, let's come back to it. In terms of Chandra, Chandra is someone who had 5 years in a economic regulatory agency, so as a regulatory officer, looking at economic regulation, learned her craft, did her craft really well, then wanted to get promoted. So she got promoted to become a regulatory manager, and in doing so moved to another agency which happened to focus on environmental regulation. So again, spent 10 years there, enjoyed that, and had the opportunity to laterally transfer to another agency, her third regulatory agency, which focused on, social aspects, keeping the community safe. So you've got someone in Chandra who has had 15 years in the regulatory saddle, and 10 of those have been as a regulatory manager. So very, very experienced. You absolutely want Chandra on your team, but that's not to say we actually need all of them on the team. So I'll make that point very clear as well. But while we're focusing on Chandra, she will use this book to say, well, when I was an economic regulator, that the term I'm thinking about meant this. As I moved to environmental regulation, it still meant the same thing, but the nuance was slightly different by 5%. Now that I'm in my third social regulatory agency, what does it mean? So Chandra will very much use the book as a fine-tuning mechanism. She knows the words, she knows the concept, she just has to contextualize it to really land the regulatory delivery in order to get better regulatory outcomes.
It's an interesting one. Thank you for that, Grant. I'll just go back to Pelin, because I think there's a point that you imply, Pelin, about different agencies, or perhaps we've touched upon this offline. Chandra's moved from agency to agency. The words may be similar, but they may have different nuances. How important is it for regulated parties, stakeholders, third parties dealing at arm's length with the government as they see it, as a whole, a collection of agencies, that we keep the words pretty similar in meaning?
Yeah, I think that's really important to have those similar words, particularly for those people who, as I said before, are on the receiving end, so the regulated parties, because they could have very different experiences from different agencies otherwise. So they might be, being told they're being audited by 2 different agencies, but one of those audits might be looking particularly at the systems kind of aspects, etc., and looking forward-looking. And another one might be using the term audit, but it's actually more what you would think of as a traditional investigation type approach. Now, the person on the receiving end of that is going to have a very different experience. I think it's really important for us to try and align what it is that we're talking about and what it is that we're doing. And just going to Katie's point as well about process, so that they can expect what kind of process they're going to be going through. And also, I think the key thing to think about is the outcome that you want. So what is it that you're trying to achieve with the particular intervention that you're choosing? That is very important, and I think if you can start with that in mind, then it's easier to craft whatever it is that you need to do, and you can get the terminology about that right at the beginning.
And I guess the reason why we're sitting here talking, if you're watching the live and you're close to us on a reasonably sunny Friday morning, is it affects regulatory outcomes. It's real, isn't it? Getting this language right is not just some highfalutin thing. It's very practical. Is one of the reasons, Grant, if I may say so, you've probably done this as very practical looking paperback, this book, without overly promoting it.
That's right, and I know we've had a discussion some time ago when you said, "Oh, is this available in an ebook?" And the answer is no. This is a book which needs to be carried and thumbed and written in the margins, because if you were Chandra, you would have a description around what a word meant, like audit, as Pelin has used. This is what it meant when I was in the environmental agency. Now that I've moved to social regulation, it's actually more of an inspection type of feel to it. So it's a living, breathing document. And look, it's paperback and cartoons, because regulation can be a dry and complex type of topic. So I think we need to lighten the mood from time to time to help people engage with it.
Definitely not if we have anything to say about it. Grant, tell me about Dwayne briefly, please.
Wow. You know, in the brackets there, it says with no regulatory experience, but has a bucket load of other experience. You know, so you see the Dwaynes of the world who have 20 plus years in the public or civil service, but that time has been spent in policy areas or service delivery areas. So they know government, they know policy, they know how to roll out a program with grants and rebates, et cetera. But then they sometimes laterally get parachuted in to become the CEO or in the senior leadership team of a regulatory agency. And it's a whole new world. I'm up the top, I'm the boss, I'm the decision maker, I'm a delegate, but I don't understand some of these words, terms, or phrases. And the people below me are very experienced, and they're, when you have a mixture of Chandras and Brians and Alicias, they don't lack confidence individually or as a collective. So, Dwayne will be learning things about regulatory powers and regulatory discretion and initiating regulatory prosecutions and those type of things. So, Dwayne's on a very, very steep learning curve, and this book is in his top drawer, so that when he reads a briefing paper and the regulatory team are going to come in, he can just do a little bit of prep and make sure that he understands and he can calibrate his understanding of the topic.
Interesting pen portrait. Thank you, Grant. It may well be, members of the audience, you're one of these people. It may well be that you have been one of these people, or you could be someone else. In just a second, you're going to get a poll on the screen where you can choose who you think you are. If you have been a black and white line drawing in the past, there is a helpline that we can give you. But in the meantime, that's for the end of the program. Which of these four people do you most closely identify with? You know, you choose one. Remember, it's who you most identify with at the moment. We all mutate, and we could have been or could be some of these people. And members of the audience, I think you can see that poll. Off you go. Your time starts now. Now, I'm just looking to see if we have the poll results. And while we're waiting for those to come through, it's a broad church, and regulatory language has lots of different dialects. I think we've sort of touched on this, but I think I'd like to dwell on it further. I mean, Antonia's just commenting in the chat, and I can see some chats going around there. Lots of different people interpreting words differently. Surveillance, intelligence, they're classic examples. You've got a term of art in one agency that could mean something completely different in another. What happens if there is this sort of inconsistency across the sector? And I'd like to sort of move it to the angle of regulatory stewardship. If we're talking regulatory stewardship, Grant, and the use of language, how important is it? What do you see as regulatory stewardship in this context?
Look, I've already put my papers in and voted. I love regulatory stewardship, and every chance I get the opportunity, I will advocate for it. But interestingly, it's misunderstood or it's misapplied. So I find myself quite often coming back to some of the first principles, and I will often say, well, it's about looking at the whole system. It's about looking at the regulatory system as an ecosystem, and it's about considering it as an asset, and it's about leaving it in a better position than when you inherited it. And I know this audience will largely know that, but to loop back around, how can you do that? How can you maintain and understand what the circumstance or the situation is now, and where you want it to go to, if you can't communicate with all those different people who make a contribution across that ecosystem? So I think it's just critically important that if we flip the word in, maybe the counterpoint is, if we thought about the financial system in government, would we just worry about what we got coming in or going out? If we worried about the health system, would we just worry about the central nervous system and not the respiratory system? We have to look at these things as a whole. So you don't have to be an expert in every part of those. But you need to be able to know your part well, and probably the part either side of what you do, to Pelin's earlier point about doing an audit versus an inspection versus an investigation, which also goes to Katie's point, working backwards from what the judge expects to what the prosecutor expects to what the investigator produces. So it's just understanding, and pardon the pun, it's just being able to navigate across those conversational topics.
Absolutely, and I'm not going to add any more or sail into any more nautical puns, because we're saved by the poll. Look at this, 26% of you identify with Alicia, and we got 13% of Brian's. Chandra comes in at a good 35%. Dwayne is 16%, and those are more adventurous, but none of the above at 10%. So we really have, I mean, we certainly haven't got 200 Brians here, and we've got a good mix. What is that? What's that telling you, just as a quick sample? Grant, what's that telling you in terms of the communicability of language?
I think it's pretty normal. I think we do have, and I think Katie really explained this well. Whilst we've used Alicia as the media and comms avatar, that can equally be the lawyer, that can equally be the scientist, that can equally be the technician. So we're talking about people who've come from a professional stream. And because of the depth and breadth of regulatory work, we do have a lot of professions that come to make a contribution. So I'm not surprised by that. Because regulation came out of mainstream policing, command and control, we do have a lot of people from policing, customs, and other mainstream enforcement agencies. It's great to know, if I've got the numbers right, 39, 34%. It's great that you've got that diversity of people who have got that Chandra experience across a number of agencies. And yeah, that 16 to 20% is probably what I normally see in my research and consulting about the senior executives who are very new to the voodoo that we do in regulation, and they're on a steep learning curve. So numbers are not surprising to me, Ian.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think Pelin, that goes to what you're saying about the kind of the multi-agency approach, and also Katie, that it's not just the frontline core regulators who really need to know this stuff. I don't know if you want to jump in eyes with you on those points.
Can I make a point on one of the previous points that Grant made? And I think that was him saying that, Alicia could be the lawyer. That doesn't sit entirely well with me. And I think the reason for that is that, yes, there are some lawyers who are never involved in this sort of work, but I think a lot of regulatory language is in fact a bit of a subset of legal language. There are things like briefs of evidence, compliance. A lot of those things actually have a legal basis to those words. And so I think I would see often the role of a lawyer in this context may well in fact be demystifying for an Alicia. And so I would urge that we also recognise that while this is a good reflection of what regulatory language means in most contexts, there are some nuances to that are set out in legislation and that have come out of judgments and things that lawyers can help you when you're in you're in a space where you need to apply it in your particular agency. You're right at that pointy end. What does this require of us? That's where hopefully your in-house lawyers can really help you demystify and understand that. But I think also for someone who's new to this, if you've got a lawyer in the agency who's been there for a while, or is quite experienced in this, they may well be able to do a bit of that translation for you. Sorry, couldn't help the lawyer plug.
No, absolutely. I think it's a really, really good point. Grant, what do you say to it in terms of the subset point?
Yeah, probably 2 points I would make. I think it goes back to an earlier point where I said a lot of the regulatory work we do came out of criminal justice, and it was crimes. So when we were doing command and control regulation, we're the government, here's the law, you did the wrong thing, you're punished. It was a simple 4-step dance, and we knew it well. But regulation is much more broader, much more nuanced, and we have partnerships and co-regulation, self-regulation. So we have ongoing relationships with our regulated entities. That's probably the first point of difference. But again, without being the pedant, with the Alicias, we're talking about a regulatory officer. So in the context of this book, a regulatory officer is really an authorised officer. So someone who has regulatory powers and will be deploying them operationally in the field. Yeah. So, but it's a really good point, Katie, and I addressed that because I knew lawyers would be picking this book up. So on page 8, there's a note of caution, which actually makes the point that and maybe I should read it because I typed it. You know, many of the words, terms, and concepts in this book are based upon, intersect, or have specific legal, operational, scientific, or technical meanings. So if you need those specific legal, operational, scientific, or technical meanings, refer to that reference material and see those specialists. This book is more about am I in the right quadrant? Am I not going to get it howlingly wrong? But it's just the first diagnostic to then go. But it's so that you know where you need to go. So I absolutely take your point. But in this context, a regulatory officer, so for everyone who's viewing, who's already got the book or who might consider it, here we're talking about a regulatory officer as being an authorised officer using regulatory powers operationally. We're talking about a regulatory manager being someone who supervises the former, but also maybe on the tools themselves and doing the complex and protracted matters. And a regulatory executive, in most cases, is usually not authorised card-carrying member, but they will have a regulatory delegation. So again, what's fascinating about the point that Katie raises is she's not wrong, and I'm not trying to over-defend it, but we're having a conversation about the subtle differences about the roles of an officer versus a manager versus an executive for what regulatory outcome, to Pelin's point, that we're trying to achieve.
And
thanks for the question.
I think we're also looking at the tectonic between the legal profession and the regulatory profession. And we'll come to that point perhaps a bit later, but I'm looking at the Q&A and keep voting on the members of the audience, because as those of you know, you get the sort of head movements as they whiz up and down. But I go straight to Paul's question, which I like very much. I see agencies, says Paul, not only using different language for the same thing, but subtly here, using a different tone in their language. What does the panel think about tone? How can we use regulatory language to get tone right? And if I have that question right, it's not just where agencies use the same word, effectively language, but nuance it to get a different effect, but it's also perhaps using different words. But tone and circumstance are key. Pelin, I'll come to you first on this, if I may.
Yeah, it's a good point, because it's looking at again, what is it that you're trying to achieve with the thing that you're doing, and the tone can change the meaning quite a lot. So it is something that we need to be kind of really mindful of, and particularly agencies that do very similar things. So if I think about the agency that I'm currently in, and my previous agency, and also some of our other sister agencies, if we're using, and I'm thinking from the health and safety perspective now, if we're using a completely different kind of tone and language, then the people that intersect with us obviously have a very different view on what it is that we're trying to do. So having some consistency in that is really, really helpful for the people that are looking at the way that we're describing things, and that we're talking about things, or we're talking to them about things, and sectors about things, that type of thing.
And I guess third parties to us are expecting one government, joined up government working better together, which is, obviously a clarion call for many. And if they're getting different nuances and different, as it were, metaphorically, tones of voice, that can be problematic. I guess it can also lead to inconsistency, Katie, can't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, sorry, Katie.
That was Katie, but Pelin, you can also jump in and say yes to that as well. And I mean, Katie, I don't know, particularly from a JR perspective, but also more generally.
Yeah. I mean, I think tone is important when you think about what you're trying to achieve. I think that was to Pelin's point earlier on. If you use a different tone, I think you are indicating a different outcome, even though you might be using very similar words. And that gives messages to the regulated, and it gives messages, if you're thinking about comms, it gives messages to the public. And I wondered if I could just pick up on one of the questions in the chat, which I think is a really interesting one. Is that all right, Ian?
Absolutely.
And this question was, do we want Alicia as a comms person to translate, or to help generate a better public understanding of regulatory language? That's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because I think if we have this language that the people who are kind of in the know speak, and, my profession is probably the most criticised in that respect, legalese, it's even got its own name. We can use common language to achieve good things, and to have good, efficient interactions between those who are working in the spaces. What we have to be really careful to do is that we don't use it in order to exclude. other people and have our little club of people who understand and people who don't. So we think about the role of a comms person. Are they translating or are they generating a better public understanding? And I think it's probably a mixture of both. And the recent example I think about is, 3 years ago or 2 years ago, how many people really understood what epidemiologists do? Did they understand exponential growth from a public health perspective? There's a whole lot of terms of art around public health that have been used in the media significantly through the COVID pandemic that people now understand. And probably if we'd not used those terms of art, there would have been more confusion. And so in that circumstance, people understanding the terms of art and using those was the right approach. And I think it probably depends how prevalent it's going to be, how well understood those are, how much reporting there is going to be about that. But I would say it's a mix. I'm not sure if others agree with me there.
Other thoughts? Members of the audience, what do you think? And while you're reflecting on that, and in a previous life, I was a legal commentator, so I completely take Katie's point about popularizing terms of art and stories for networks and normalizing possibly sort of strange phenomena. And it is an art in and of itself. And it's also something that evolves, isn't it? I mean, Grant, just in terms of what you've produced itself, a product of lockdown, of course, you were saying to me offline as we wrote the book. It's one of the nice things to have come out of lockdown. The language is likely to evolve, isn't it? And it does evolve in practice through use.
Absolutely. So two quick points to wrap about the question about Alicia, is she a translator? Yes. I think we're all translators. So really shameless plug now, but it is with a point. So when I did the book, the trigger words on the page are regulation, compliance, and enforcement. They mean different things to different people. They mean different things to different officers. Equally, are we educating, engaging, or enforcing? So just that 2, 3 by 3, regulation, compliance, enforcement, or engage, educate, and enforce, that is a myriad of combinations of tones. Back to the first point. To the question which was asked there about evolving, which I think is what you said, Ian, I've flagged that because like all languages, our regulatory language will evolve. So I've actually put on page 339, staying in touch, saying, language will evolve. If a definition or description changes, please let me know. And I've already had a few people, send me emails. So for edition 2, when it happens, regulatory capital, regulatory systems, agile regulations, reg tech, blue tape, which I researched myself last week, and similar things. So already by having the book, having conversations, people are thinking, well, when you say that and I think of this, what about this? So it is an evolving process, not only the new words and the new descriptions, but how we interpret them in the first instance, and then how we absolutely apply them and integrate it into our regulatory stewardship and delivery.
I think that's really right, and things are going to evolve as we evolve as regulators as well. So modern regulatory practice is all around being responsive and changing your approach depending on again what the outcome is that you want and the environment that you're working in. So as we as agencies create new types of interventions, they in themselves will probably have new definitions and a new language that goes along with those. So it's like anything, it is going to evolve and change and shift over time.
And I think it goes to Bikram's point in the Q&A that it's the language and the tone. They're both dictated by myriads of things, and therefore it's important to understand what these are. Members of the audience, I can see that you're buzzing around on the chat, and I detect that some of what you're saying actually you may want to direct through the Q&A. So I'll use my common sense, but if you want to direct a question to the panel, use the Q&A, please. And obviously the chat is more for you to use, but some of these are multi-layer. One question from another grant in the Q&A, which is very definitely in the Q&A, is we've been talking about inconsistencies between agencies, but what if you've got an internal handover? What if you've got a definition of something that varies within the agency, and there's a handover from one part of the business to the other, say it's to the compliance and regulatory function, say it's where policy have helped procure legislation, that's in play. there's there is a level of post-legislative scrutiny, but it effectively goes into execution. Are there any hints or resources for how to manage and communicate that handover? And I do a plug here because it goes to a critical point, in my view, on the relationship between the policy and the operational executive arm of the business. I see Pelin nodding. I therefore construe that as Pelin answering that question first.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Grant talked before about the sort of policy design and evaluations normally done by policy people. And being a practitioner myself, I've been on the receiving end of then legislation that doesn't actually help when it comes to achieving the outcome that you want. This is very obviously always well-intended people, trying to work through what is a complex environment. And you might find yourself with legislation that says that you need to do inspections or investigations, for example. And when you actually dig into the intent of what the legislation is looking for, it's not that, it's actually something else. It's a different type of intervention that is required. So I think by having particularly operational people part of the conversation in the policy design, and if you're having the same, you're using the same kind of language for the thing that it is that you're actually wanting to achieve, then that makes things a lot easier than in the past. You may have received a piece of legislation as a practitioner that then you look at it and you say, I don't actually know what I can do with this. It's really important that we're all talking the same language and we're understanding what it is that we're trying to do.
And to be presumably, Katie, it also keeps it away from the more sort of exposed end of judicial review or misunderstanding.
Oh, absolutely. I totally endorse what you say, Pelin. I think having the people who are going to be using and applying the legislation involved in legislation design is really, really important. And, also maybe bringing lawyers into that process early who understand how the courts are likely to interpret those terms, because that's going to be the ultimate test of whether or not you have followed what your legislation requires. I mean, no one wants to end up there, but that's actually, the reality, and that's the judge over your shoulder suggestion. And to that conversation just before about the evolution of regulatory language, I think you're absolutely right, Grant, that, it is evolving, it will evolve, the meanings will change, the way people apply them will change. But the great thing about having a resource like this is it forces a conversation. So, differences in understanding are exposed. And if there are good reasons for those differences in understanding, then those can be acknowledged as well, rather than people talking at cross purposes without realizing they're talking at cross purposes, because I think that's probably the biggest danger, right?
Because, the hemorrhaging of effectively opportunity cost, the loss of a chance, the inefficiency, even if you do get on the same page ultimately linguistically, is huge, isn't it, Grant? If you're not speaking the same language, if you're not getting your terms of art right, if there isn't even that attitude of communication, which is also something I think that the stewardship part of what navigating regulatory language embraces, that's expensive.
Absolutely right. And I think one of the things I've learned out of writing the book and researching for the book and testing the thinking is we need to start at the end. We need to start with what is the regulatory outcome we're pursuing. If we know very early it's so egregious it's going to be a prosecution, our level, pitch, tone, language and engagement is going to take a certain look and feel, and we'll engage the specialists along the way. If we're wanting an education, outreach, communication outcome, we will take a different approach. So I think linked to your regulatory stewardship aspect, Ian, is, well, what are we trying to achieve? So let's be very, very clear about the regulatory outcome we're trying to achieve. Once we're clear about that, we can work out the regulatory tools, options, approaches that we have. That will let us embrace and lean into different expertise across the agency. You asked me a couple of days ago, Ian, when you were sort of saying, I'm going to throw to you at some stage, Grant, and ask you a question about what are some of the problematic words. And I think my throwaway answer was, look, there's so many I can't think. It just happens all the time. But the sort of pre-performance nerves, a few have come to me this morning. And I think it's things like, which has been touched upon, we're going to come and do an inspection. But is it an inspection, or is it a compliance check, or is it an audit, or is it a part of an investigation? And then linking back to Katie's point, what legislative legal provisions and levers do we need to satisfy? By extension, we're here by consent. Old mate said we could come into the, well, no, consent needs to be informed. Consent needs to be in writing. They need to be told they've got the right to withdraw that at any time without, punishment. Yeah. So we have these type of conversations where it's assumed when the lawyer gets, they said they had consent, but they'll go through with it. No, you didn't have consent. So that's one example of at a functional level: audit, compliance, check, inspection, investigation. I'm not going to let you off the hook at some stage, Ian, but we do have to come back to customer, client, and crooks. So I'll let you throw it to me when you think it's
There'll be a link, Grant. There'll be a cheesy link, but it will be a link nonetheless. But members of the audience, we're about 3/4 of the way through, and if you've just recently joined us, really what we've brought out, I think, quite strongly is the importance of regulatory language, how it connects to the regulatory profession in its own right, how it links to regulatory stewardship. And also, it's really resonating. I can see this in the chats and some of the questions already. Please keep all of those pumping across the ecosystem point. Interconnectedness of all things, to sound like the sci-fi author Douglas Adams. Connected parties also need to critically know this language. The importance, perhaps, of looking at conversations that we've had in the past. Are they conducted in the same regulatory language? I make an unashamed plug for the conversation series, which we published and produced in 2021, in particular the film on regulatory and policy practitioners, building on the work about early doors dialogue between the right people to avoid post-legislative work afterwards. You get your settings right, you get your conversations right, and also the proportionality point, which I can see is being picked up by John and Lisa in the chat. It's not always a hard-edged legislative tool. It's not always that's the necessary ingredient. It also goes to tone as well as manner and form. So do please keep the questions coming in. I guess the other thing that occurs to me, I'm going to throw this one back to you, Grant, and actually do link it to what you've just said about the customers. When we're looking at boundaries between, and this is something Lisa's picking up in the chat, so I'll steal it, between inspection and investigation, how much is it that we just need to be really explicit, to almost to the point of destruction, about what we mean in our own system? Because if we can't get that in order, there's a difficulty for third parties. Clarity's key, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think at the heart of this book is greater precision around language. So my focus is on greater precision, but not saying it is the absolute definition, because it's still a disputed space, except for those legal concepts that Katie would deal with, daily. What's the burden of proof? Is it beyond reasonable doubt for a criminal matter, or is it on the balance of probabilities for a civil? Am I taking a statement or an affidavit, or am I having a conversation? So there are aspects about where it's binary and we have to get it right, and it's absolutely legally the right way or the wrong way. But then there are other tools that we can nuance as long as we're clear ourselves, with our co and peer regulators, and most importantly with the regulated entities. So that's probably the first point I would say. And there was another point there about, I think it's Antonia's point about consistency of approaches. So what I will say is this book, the main part, the A to Z, has over 500 words and terms and phrases that you can bounce around and write your own adventure. What does a brief of evidence mean? That takes me back to a statement, et cetera, et cetera. But at the back end, there are 6 key concepts and frameworks. And I do think if I can give you a short story and paraphrase Dwayne here, it might help. So I've already mentioned the first one, which is the 6 parts of the extended regulatory spectrum, from regulatory regime design through to regulatory performance evaluation. But critically for this story, step 5 is enforcement. Then there's another one, which is the 4 key regulatory perspectives. Is it the regulator, the regulated, stakeholders, or the wider community? So for stakeholders, let's say we're talking about a peak industry or professional body. Okay, that's the scenario. And the third one is it tactical, operational, or strategic? So that's probably known to a lot of your audience, but Dwayne's come into this. He's now the head or the deputy head of an agency. So I've developed at the front of the book, the 643 code. So imagine you've got 15 minutes with the deputy, Solicitor General or the deputy director of the agency. You want to be able to come in and say, look, boss, this is step 5. It's enforcement on that one. It's then step 3, because we think the certified practicing accountants are going to be really interested in our approach here. And it's step 2, because it's at operational level across this regulated domain. So it's a 5, 3, 2 type of model. And that image came to me because my first job was in a bank where you had to have three codes to get into the safe. But the imagery there is when you've got that time with the boss, you want to be very clear, boss, this is about enforcement, about how stakeholders will be impacted in an operational activity. So really bring precision around that discussion and their advice and their delegation, but also appreciate that there's other aspects around that which we'll have to cover off on. So I'm hoping that's the consistency of approach and principles theme that I'm picking up in some of the chat, that it's not just A to Z, here's your definition, it's within a context of other frameworks and concepts. Thank you, Ian.
And I think it's also just picking up on that, Run, from what's been said, picking up on your banking experiences, it goes to the currency of the regulator. And I think one C word that we have been missing, which is critical, is capability, regulatory capability. Yep. Pelin, did you want to jump in and say something about that, particularly from the WorkSafe stance?
Yeah, I mean, obviously having capable people is something is really key for all regulators. And we've talked about, part of what GREG is there for is to recognise that this is a profession. Being a regulatory practitioner working in a regulatory environment is a profession, and lots of other professions have their language, and we have our language as well. So understanding what that means is obviously really important, and helps to build people's capability, but also it helps with sharing that capability across different agencies as well. So if you know what it is that you're wanting to do and you understand somebody's background, the type of work that they've been involved in, then you can come together to solve problems in a more sort of in an easier kind of way than if you're looking at things completely differently. If you don't actually understand what that person or people may have done in the past, for example. I hope that answers your question.
It certainly does, and it actually just raises some more, because it's the point about the regulatory profession. And let's look at this, because of course the legal profession, Katie, has its own distinct trappings and identity. It may well be, and I don't think I'm unreasonable to suggest this in public, that there are members of the regulatory profession, which does exist, who may not be as conscious of their professional membership as being part of a professional class. And so what do you say to the point that regulatory language is not just something for its own sake to bolster a profession, but it's actually essential? I mean, it's your point offline, Grant, I think, the medical illusion, which I like very much. I wonder if I can call you in on that. Yeah, about the bones.
Yes, as life imitates art. Oh gosh, nearly about 10 years ago now, I was knocked off my push bike in my street. But this is the journey. I get picked up off the road by the ambulance paramedics. Then I'm seen by the on-duty doctor at accident emergency, then the nurses, then the physio, chiro, rehabilitation officer, MRIs, X-rays. So over my 5-year rehabilitation, I was exposed to 10 parts of the medical profession. And thankfully for me, they all knew what the bone was called. They all knew which joint it was connected to, and they all knew how to treat it. So that goes back to an earlier point that I think you were discussing, Pelin and Katie, about when things are handed over. So it didn't matter who looked at my case notes. They had enough of understanding of the anatomy and what was going on. They can do their job more effectively and efficiently because they know what's preceded their involvement. So I think we haven't got that in regulation. That's when you do see it handed over from one part of the regulatory agency to another. It's, well, one, it's either assumed and it doesn't manifest itself until later on and it's really expensive, or you have to go back and say, what do you mean? And rework and redo some things. So I think the medical analogy, and to Katie's profession, lawyers have qualifications, lawyers have their own language, GREG is pushing regulatory training and qualifications, and we're having this discussion about regulatory language, and the broader context of all of your webinars and videos is how can we have better conversations with each other. So I think those things bookend each other really nicely.
And I think in terms of the bookending, Pink's Guide becomes the new Grey's Anatomy, as has possibly been said. Katie, I think you're about to jump in with something.
Yeah, I guess to say that in that medical analogy, I think that would work in terms of one regulatory regime or one agency where there are actual commonalities in the legislation between, you know, what is actually meant. This comes to this point that I've just seen on this Q&A from Cynthia that says, you know, see the importance of speaking the same language, but some legislation provides and sets the interpretations of certain regulatory terms. How do we navigate around those different legal interpretations? And the reality is, if the statute says it is defined in a particular way, then it's defined in a particular way. And maybe in those circumstances, one of the keys is within your agency, within the people who are involved in that regulation under that statute, how do we make sure all of those people are speaking the same language? Because they won't necessarily all be at the moment. So every step of that way, and that is well understood by the regulated as well in that framework. But that won't always translate into every other regulatory regime because of the statutory differences.
Yes.
And just to build on that, can I just build on that point from Katie? I think that's absolutely right. And also, you know, the regulated party, it's so important that they understand the process that they're going to be going through. So, you know, so explaining that at the beginning around what it is that you're actually going to be doing and how you're going to be interacting with them and the types of things that are going to be happening, because they might have in their head something completely different, and then obviously that doesn't always go quite so well. So being really clear with the regulated party what it is that you're going to do.
And I think the point that you made earlier, Pelin, is if the policy and operational relationship were more bilateral, these things would be legislatively preempted, because we're not in a utopia, but you just wouldn't have the troubles that you get down the line. And I can see vigorous nods there. We are unfortunately running out of time, members of the audience. I'm going to just go to finish off briefly with each of you. Pelin, your final overarching thoughts on what you've heard and what you'd offer by way of sort of closing the conversation for your part today.
Thank you, Ian. I think it's been a really great conversation, and I think this has been mentioned a couple of times during this session, but it's really great to be having this conversation and to open it up and as regulators to talk about this stuff, so that when we are you know, going about our daily work, and particularly when we're working together, that we can talk about this, and we can kind of say, well, you know, how are we going to navigate through this really complex regulatory language, and what is it that we're trying to achieve, and what's the best way of achieving that together?
Thank you very much, Pelin. And Katie, final thought from you.
Yeah, one of the things that this has emphasised for me, I guess, is that there is nuance in language. You know, and that nuance can be all important in terms of a process that's followed, and in terms of whether or not that process will stand the test if it is subsequently tested. And so if you're in those tricky circumstances, you know, getting the expert advice on how those things are likely to be interpreted is really important.
And thanks for contributing to this conversation. And finally, Grant.
Well, thank you. I think what I take away from the two previous conversations we've had here is that regulation is not a religious experience. It doesn't matter what we think or feel. We are bound by the statute and we have to follow the rules. So when the job's on, there sometimes is only one way to do it. There is only one definition to be followed, and we need to be precise. And that's because it came out of command and control and crime type of work. But as we're working broader with regulatory outcomes, with regulated parties and that, there's greater nuance. So all this book is meant to do is, when we do have scope, when we do have flexibility, let's have the internal discussion to get our agreed working definition or our agreed posture on an issue, so that we're not at cross purposes across media, legal, operations, technical, so we get better bang for our regulatory buck.
Thank you very much, Grant. It's a lovely place to end it, Pelin, Katie and Grant. Thank you all very much. We're just about approaching the hour. Members of the audience, Grant's book is launched through an ANSOG webinar. It's out at the moment, but Monday week, and you can find it online. Things going on in the world of GREG. Join us, please, at the end of next month, the 27th of May, when we have a conversation about regulatory failure, not least failure that's possibly, at least in part, provoked by a misuse or a misunderstanding of regulatory language. I close, as I started, with an embi karakia. Kia hiki te tapu, kia watiai te ara, kia torukiai te o marama, huie tai kie. Members of the audience, stay safe, stay well. And until next time, from all of us on the GREG team and in the virtual studio, kia kite anō.